Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here this evening to talk about the life and times of Julia Child. She was a fascinating woman, a really interesting person, and very influential in cooking and in other things too. And as Stephen said, I did have the opportunity to interview her back in the 1980s and to talk with her a few times after that too, and I'll tell you more about that in the presentation. But let's start with Julia's life herself. She was born Julia Carol McWilliams in August of 1912 in Pasadena, California. Her father was a businessman and her mother was a homemaker and socialite. This is her picture when she was 18 years old, when she enrolled in Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and 4 years later graduated with a degree in history, but without a husband. And back then, women went to college, a lot of them, to get a husband, so that was a kind of a disappointment for her. But this is her college yearbook picture. I think it's the youngest one I've seen of her. She returned home to Pasadena, California after she graduated from university and spent a year going to parties and doing other social activities. She was known as a party girl, a fun person to be around, very open, very unpretentious. She had a good sense of humor. She was sort of a tomboy. She was slim, attractive. She liked fashionable clothes and she could wear them. She was 6 feet 2 inches tall. By 1935, she'd become restless with her life in California, and she was getting older, and she didn't have any serious boyfriends yet. So she moved to New York City for more opportunities. She worked in the advertising department of a big department store there for a couple of years, but she was always at loose ends. She didn't really know what kind of career she wanted. She didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. She actually wasn't considered a very serious or very ambitious person. So in 1937, 2 years after she'd moved to New York, she moved back to her parents' home in Pasadena, California. And there she drifted around working a short time at one job here for a couple months, another job there for 6 months, and she just enjoyed social life for the next 5 years. She was considered sort of a social butterfly. But knowing how to cook wasn't part of that scene. Ruth Reichel, the former editor of Gourmet magazine, wrote an article about Julia Child in which she said, "Girls of her class did not cook. There were servants to do that." And Julia herself said, "Middle-class women did not have careers. You were to marry and have children and be a nice mother. You didn't go out and do anything." But along came World War II. And when the war began, Julia felt like she ought to do something to help the war effort. And by then, she was 30 years old. So she left in 1942, left California to work as a secretary typing index cards at the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C. And a little bit later, about 6 months later or so, she got a job as a file clerk at the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, and that was the precursor of our Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, today. 1944, she finally had the opportunity for the kind of adventure that she'd just been looking for all of her life. She sailed on a troop ship from California with hundreds of sailors, going from there to Ceylon, which we call Sri Lanka now, for her first assignment with the OSS overseas. And that's the barracks that she lived in Ceylon. And that year she met Paul Child, who was also working for the OSS in Ceylon. He was 10 years older than she. He was considerably shorter than she was. He was very urbane and sophisticated. He really appealed to her. He had lived in France as a child. He spoke French fluently. He was a very good photographer, a very good artist, and they started dating when they met in Asia working for the OSS. This is one of the photos that he took of her in Ceylon. Some of these others coming up are too, others of his. Julia was in charge of the OSS registry, which meant the files for classified documents in Ceylon and later on in China. She always claimed she was never a spy, but she handled all the top secret documents, so she knew what was going on. She and Paul both worked then in the OSS in China, in Kunming and in Chongqing, until the end of the war. And they spent a lot of time together, they were dating, they ate out a lot together, and he taught her a lot about Chinese food. But in 1945, after the war was over, they both came back to the United States. Julia returned to her family's nice home in Pasadena, California, and Paul went back to the East Coast where he was from. But the separation made them realize that they were really in love and they wanted to be together. So in 1946, they were married in Pennsylvania. Notice the bandage on her eye? They were in a car wreck before the wedding. And they came to, I believe it was his brother's house where they had the wedding in Pennsylvania. And at that time, now the first and only marriage for her and for Paul, she was 34 and he was 44. But she wasn't about to let that car accident get in the way of getting married finally. Well, they remained happily married for the next 48 years until Paul passed away in 1994. They never had children, even though they wished they had, but they were a very close and loving couple. They were best friends in addition to being husband and wife. And later on, she said, if we could just have the kitchen and the bedroom, that would be all we would need. Oops, I'm sorry, went too far there. And another one of her lines, cooking is like love, it should be entered into with abandon or not at all. In 1946 to 48, they lived together in Washington, D.C., where Paul worked for the U.S. State Department. And then in 1948, he was assigned to the United States Information Agency, which is abbreviated USIA, not CIA, USIA, the propaganda arm of the American government. And his first assignment with USIA, first overseas assignment, was in Paris in 1948. So they arrived at the harbor in Le Havre in Paris, arrived by ship with their big American car, unloaded the car off the ship, and drove to Paris. And on the way to Paris, they stopped at this restaurant, La Couronne, in Rouen, France. And that's where they stopped for lunch. And now it's a famous restaurant because that's where Julia Child had her epiphany about French food. And this is the interior of the restaurant with a tour group. I led 2 tours in 2010 that were called In the Footsteps of Julia Child. And we went from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to across to France. We went on the Queen Mary 2, and then we went on and went to all of her old haunts, and this was where we started with the meal that she had that awakened her to French food. And actually, it's a very simple meal. It was 6 fresh raw oysters from that region, sole meunière, it's a way of cooking the fish sole, and then strawberries and some other mixed berries, depending on which season you're there, with creme fraiche. Well, I did one tour in September, and I led another tour in October, and on the September tour, I noticed there's a lot of people that aren't eating these oysters. These were fabulous oysters. And so when I went back in October, I kind of kept my eye out on the tables, and it turned out there were a lot of people who just don't eat raw oysters, or they were afraid of getting sick from oysters. So I just said, well, if you don't want yours, you're just going to leave them. The waiter's going to take them away. Just pass them over this way. So I got 24 raw oysters for my first course. I will never forget that meal, and Julia didn't forget hers. Well, Julia immediately fell in love with Paris and with French food, and she just became fascinated with French cooking. So in 1949, to learn how to cook French, she enrolled in the Cordon Bleu cooking school in Paris, and that's her there with the chef instructor. It was a 2-year course in learning how to cook classic French cuisine. Another picture there. I think that's with the lady who ran the school on the left, who did not like Julia. And in 1951, she earned her diploma from Cordon Bleu. This is her apartment in Paris. She and Paul also entertained a lot at their apartment. They were both very outgoing people, and they really liked entertaining a lot. They gave French dinner parties with excellent wines for their friends and colleagues, and Paul was known as quite a great connoisseur of wines. And this is her in their apartment with their cat. They had a cat everywhere they lived, and so this was their first cat together, the French cat together. This is the kitchen in that apartment. Now notice all the cookware that she had. There's cast iron skillets, there's casserole dishes, there's stock pots, there's copper pans, there's even a pressure cooker there. And that'll give you an idea of the size of the kitchen and the size of Julia. The other problem was that kitchen was not on the same floor as the dining room, so she had to run up and down the stairs, back and forth, to cook the next course and then bring it down and serve it and eat with everybody else and then run back up and get the next course and so on. That's the stone sink where she did her dishes in the kitchen. No dishwasher, no automatic dishwasher. And so Julia had finally found her love in life, her true focus in life besides her husband. And that was her intense interest in French food and learning how to cook it. In 1952, she started her own cooking school in Paris with two French women, and they called it the École des Trois Gourmands, the School of the Three Gourmands. This is Julia with her French partners Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold, and together with them, she also began researching, writing, and testing recipes for what would eventually become her first cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Between 1952 and 1961, she worked on that cookbook for 9 long, hard years, and when it was finally published in the US in '61. But in the meantime, in 1953, right after she started the cooking school, she and Paul got reassigned to Marseille in southern France, and that was his next assignment with US Information Agency. So she discovered the delights of Provençal cooking, which is regional cooking. It's not like the classic French she was learning in Paris. Learned how to make bouillabaisse and other kinds of dishes from Provence. Over the next 8 years, she and Paul lived in Germany, Norway, and Washington, D.C. because of his job as an artist, illustrator, and designer for USIA exhibits. This is a picture of them in Norway. This was their Valentine's card that they sent from where they lived in Plittersdorf, Germany. And it gives you a good idea of their sense of humor, too. Julia loved living abroad, and she found, that was a great adventure to her, and she was discovering foods in all these different countries. She was a really adventuresome eater herself. She would try anything. She was always curious about, how do you make that? Show me how to make it. I want to see how it's prepared. I want to taste it. But French food, despite all of that, French food remained her favorite. I think her second favorite was Chinese, which of course she learned with Paul when they lived in China. Well, in 1961, Paul finally retired from the government service, and they moved back to the U.S. and bought this house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is still there. That's a photo that I took of it on this tour. And that's the house they lived in for most of the rest of their lives. And 1961 was a big year for Julia because Mastering the Art of French Cooking was finally published. And Julia then was 49 years old. It's her first big accomplishment at 49 years old. She made her first TV appearance that same year on NBC's Today Show, showing how to make an omelet. I think it flipped right on that one. And in 1962, she made her first appearance on a public television show in Boston, and that soon led to her own TV series, The French Chef, even though she was neither French nor a chef. How many of you have seen that series? Some, some of you are too young to have seen that series, right? But you could still see it on YouTube. Well, in 1963, that's what it looks like on the set of a cooking show, believe me. In February of 1963, the French Chef TV series debuted on WGBH television in Boston, and it went on to become one of the most popular shows on television. So Julia was age 50 when she began her TV career, and she went on to star in several more television series during her long, long life. It's one of the pictures from the show. In 1963, the same year she began working in television, she also began writing a food column for the Boston Globe newspaper. And that year, she and Paul also built a small house in Provence, France. It was on the land of her friend Simone Beck, and they had that house for a long time till they had to sell it for other reasons. But that was their vacation home for 28 years, and they both loved France so much they tried to go back every year. It's a beautiful place. This is her kitchen in Provence. Notice that she has a lot of kitchen utensils and a lot of kitchen gadgets. Notice the tabby cat potholder over toward the right, because she was a great lover of cats. And during the next decade, from 1964 to 1974, this was a period of really hard work for Julia. In 1964, she received a major award for the French Chef TV series. In 1965, she began Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 2. In 1966, she won an Emmy for the French Chef TV series. And that same year, she was on the cover of Time magazine. In 1967, she got an award from the French government for her work for educating Americans about French cuisine. And that book, The French Chef Cookbook, was published based on the television series. Something most people don't know is that in that same year, she had breast cancer. And she had a radical mastectomy that year, but only her closest friends knew about it. That didn't come out until really many years after she'd passed away. In 1970, her next big cookbook, then, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 2, after 9 more years of work, Volume 2 was published. So those 2 volumes took up 18 years of her life in terms of working on a cookbook. But in 1974, she had a major setback. Her beloved husband, Paul, had a heart attack, and then he had several small strokes, and he never really fully recovered from them. She kept him at home for as long as she could. She kept him involved in all aspects of her life. It was a very busy life she was having. And it was really difficult for her because he was a difficult person to deal with at that point. His personality had changed. But she did it. She was so loyal and so loving with him. And finally, she had to put him in a nursing home in 1989. But after she did that, she visited him every day that she was home in Massachusetts. And when she was out traveling on the road for her work, she phoned him every day. So they were devoted up to the end of his life. Well, meanwhile, while all this is going on, she kept up her very busy career. She wrote a food column every month for McCall's magazine. She made regular appearances on ABC's Good Morning American TV show, and she worked as the food editor for Parade magazine. It's enough to keep you busy. It's a really grueling schedule for someone who's in her 60s moving on into her 70s, but she kept it up. And this is the period when I met her, when she was 72 years old, back in 1984. And I'm going to leave that up on the screen while I tell you about interviewing her for the Stars and Stripes newspaper. Now, it wasn't that newspaper because that's 1945 and I wasn't even born then. But she was working with the OSSN, and that was the best picture I could find of the Stars and Stripes. It looked just like that when I worked for them in the 1980s and 90s. And I had just started in 1983 as the food writer for this newspaper and writing a large food article once a week for the Thursday newspaper. And a few months after I started, the editor called me up and she said, I want to send you to to Paris to interview Julia Child. And I'm thinking, whoa, that's a plum assignment for somebody who's just starting out as a journalist. And she said, all expenses paid. And I went, yes, we'll do this. And I took my husband along and put him on the expense account, which worked out very fine because he did the photographs for that. So the editor had set up the time for this interview with Julia Child, but I was really worried about doing it. I was just starting out as a journalist, and I'd never interviewed anybody like that before. I'd never interviewed anybody as a journalist before. And now think about this. This is 1984. I couldn't go online and find out things about Julia Child to ask questions about. I had 2 of her cookbooks. I didn't even have Mastering the Art of French Cooking then. I just had 2 of her others, the French Chef series, the French Chef one, and maybe something else later. And We didn't have a library where there were Julia books like you've got here on the shelves. There was no internet, as I said, no way to find looking her up online. So my husband Tom and I got together and thought about, well, what have we seen on her French Chef TV series we could ask her about, et cetera, et cetera. We were kind of brainstorming it and making up a bunch of little ditzy questions. The editor added a couple more, and I had this all handwritten down on a yellow pad. And we get to Paris, and the interview was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon at the La Varenne Cooking School. And Julia was late, almost by an hour, because she was having lunch with a bunch of honchos from the International Association of Cooking Schools. So we waited and waited, and finally she showed up, and her assistant ushered us into this little room that was like a broom closet in the back of the school. There was just room for a table and the 3 of us around the table on the chairs, and that was it. And my husband was there to take the photographs. And I bought a miniature tape recorder, and I was going to tape this session too. Well, she came in, we all introduced ourselves, and I explained that I was the food writer for the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and she started asking me about the job there before I even had a chance to ask her anything. And she was just so interested in things that, we got started talking, and I thought, well, I want her to know that, look, I'm just a freelancer. I'm a regular freelancer. I'm in the newspaper every week, but I'm not a staff person. And in fact, my husband over here taking the pictures is not a Stars and Stripes photographer. He's my husband. And really, we have a day job, and our day job is we're both university professors. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, we're professors with the University of Maryland's program in Munich. And so she said, well, what's the University of Maryland doing in Germany? And I explained to her that the university taught courses at U.S. military bases around the world, and we were actually at one of those military bases in Munich, and that we'd lived lots of places in Europe and Asia working on that job for the past 7 years. Well, she was fascinated by that and started asking me about where we'd lived in those places, and pretty soon, this is like a dinner party conversation. We're swapping stories about food markets in Greece and taking cooking classes on Okinawa and U.S. Information Agency projects back in Washington, D.C., because she was delighted to discover that my husband and I had both worked for U.S. Information Agency before we worked for the University of Maryland. And she just felt like, well, we were all friends. So I hadn't turned on the tape recorder. I hadn't asked her any of the questions on my list, and this was a 30-minute interview. And when 30 minutes was up, her assistant knocked on the door and opened it and said, Julia, the time's up. And Julia was very nice, very polite. She looked at her and said, we're not finished. Please go away. So the assistant shuts the door. So we were still talking. It turned out Julia had just read Barbara Tuchman's book, Stillwell and the American Experience in China. And it turned out Tom and I had just finished that book. So we started talking about that book and about her experiences in China. And, it's almost another half hour's gone by, and I kicked Tom and I said, turn on the tape recorder, because I'd forgotten even to do that. So when that second 30 minutes went by, knock, 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 her assistant comes in and said, Julia, your other appointment is waiting. And Julia said, go away, very nicely, but no, we were not finished. Shuts the door, and we continue talking. By then, at least we've got the tape recorder going. So finally, I decided I'd better pull out these questions and ask her the stuff. I've got to have an interview here with her about French cooking and all that, and here we are having a lot of fun with dinner party conversation. So I got out my questions. She was bored with them in the same way, because I was asking the same question every other journalist probably asked her all her life. And she quickly got the subject back onto more interesting things like history and politics, and did talk about nouvelle cuisine in France and her attitude toward French housewives cooking and stuff like that. And it was a really lively, fun interview. But hour and a half now had gone by. Knock, knock, knock on the door. Here's the assistant, who is frantic by then, and she's saying, Julia, you've got to be at the reception in 30 minutes. And it turned out this was a big reception in Paris for her, and she was the celebrity guest. So she stood up. I'm 5'4", she's 6'2". She stood up and looked at Tom and me and said, are you up for walking? And we said, sure. We didn't know what she was talking about. She said, follow me. So we walked out of La Varenne, and we finished the next half hour of that interview on the streets of Paris during rush hour with me trying to keep up with her because she walked so fast. Tom's running around trying to take pictures. And then we got to the big hotel where she was having her reception and shook hands and thanked her. 2 hours with Julia Child is really tiring. It's wonderful, but it's exhausting. And Tom and I looked at each other and found the nearest bistro, got a glass of wine each, and sat down and said, oh, we just spent 2 hours with Julia Child. And then I panicked because I thought, I don't really have an interview. I mean, what in the world am I going to write about? We were just discussing these kinds of things. And Tom said, don't worry, you'll be able to pull it all together, right? Well, he was right. It did work out that way. And it turned out that the things that we had recorded and part of the conversation that we had about her life in China and about her work with the OSS had not been published very much anywhere else. And so that interview in Stars and Stripes, I have found out later, has been cited in a couple of biographies of Julia because that was some of the early information. But that's when people just didn't know that she had done that before because they focused on her as the French chef and the author of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. So fast forward now from 1984 to 1992. It is 8 years later, and Tom and I are at the Oxford Symposium on Food at Oxford University in England, and both of us were presenting papers that year at the symposium. And for Saturday lunch, they always had a potluck buffet where all of us brought foods from different countries. And we were standing in line, all waiting to pick up our dinner plates and go get some food for lunch. And Tom was in front of me, and he looked back to say something to me, and then he looked over my shoulder and he said, look behind you. And I did, and it was Julia Child. And everybody else was standing around trying to be cool because they didn't want to act like eager beavers. And of course, a lot of them were very reserved English people, and they weren't going to run up to her and say, oh, Julia, can I have your autograph? So I thought, okay, I'll be cool too. And we started loading up our plates with food. And Julia looked and saw me, and she said, I know you. And she said, you're the one who wrote that lovely article about me for Stars and Stripes. Now, that was 8 years before. And she said, you're, and I could tell she didn't remember my name. So I said, Sharon Hudgins, and she went, right, are you and your husband still teaching for the University of Maryland in Germany? Now, this is an 80-year-old woman, and she sees thousands of people in her life every year, and she's famous, and she remembered that. And I just thought, yeah, I was stunned about that. Well, she came to our presentations of papers that afternoon at Oxford, stayed and asked a whole bunch of questions, walked down the stairs with us, wanted to keep talking with Tom and me because she had so many really, really intelligent questions. And later on, I had an opportunity to write about her a couple of other times. I had sent her that Stars and Stripes article, by the way, and I got a very nice thank you letter from her after that was published in 1984. So later on in the 90s, when I'd write a small something about her for a magazine, I would always just send her a clip of it, and I always got back really nice thank you note signed by her. Typed on, by the way, on cards about the size of a postcard, but typed on a manual typewriter, and then signed Julia Child. And I just treasured those, of course. And the last one was she had heard that we were moving from Germany to go teach in Siberia, and when I got back from Siberia, she wrote and asked me about our experiences there. Figure that now. She's in her mid-80s by that time, mid to late 80s. So, I really treasured those experiences with her, but when I've told that story to other people or listened to other people's stories, people who knew her, this isn't unique, what I just told you, that so many people have had the same experience with her because she was just that kind of person. She was always interested in other people's lives, and she always followed up with thank you notes. She was of the generation that did that, diplomat's wife who did that, and they were all personal and genuine. So I think that was really very, very nice. So let me move on to this. This was just from the Oxford Symposium, and the next one is from Gastronomica magazine. If you want to read that interview that I did in Stars and Stripes, that was published in 2005, a year after she passed away, in this special issue of Gastronomica, the Journal of Food and Culture. And I don't know if the library has it. You can probably get it from interlibrary loan anyway. Okay, so it was an entire issue devoted to Julia Child, written by people who knew her, who had worked with her, and so forth. And then in 2012, This story I just told you about interviewing her for the Stars and Stripes was published by the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Well, Julia Child lived for 12 more years after we saw each other at that conference in Oxford. And I saw her again a couple more times after that at professional food conferences and things like that. But those were very busy 12 years for Julia as she aged from her 80s into her 90s. In 1993, she was instrumental in establishing a new graduate program in food studies at Boston University, and it was one of the first of its kind in the U.S. But the next year, 1994, Paul passed away at the age of 92, and that was his age of 92, and that was a difficult time for Julia. But she wasn't somebody to let life get her down. She eventually began dating another man in her 80s. Roy Bailey was a family friend, and he became her boyfriend and her constant companion for the rest of her life. They traveled together, they partied together well into her late 80s. In 1966, she won another Emmy for her TV work. In 1998, she bought an apartment in an assisted living facility in a community in California. She loved California and had always planned to retire there anyway. And she realized she was getting older and was going to need something like that as her life went on. In the year 2000, she received the French Legion of Honor Medal, the highest decoration bestowed by the President of France. And in 2001, she decided to move permanently from her large house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to her apartment in California. And so this is her in her much smaller kitchen there. That same year, 2001, that she moved to California, her kitchen in her Cambridge house was dismantled and moved to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and then reassembled there as a permanent exhibit as a national treasure. How many of you have seen that? Yeah, oh good, yeah. So you got to see finally, because the TV shows, by the way, were all done in her kitchen. They didn't have a special set. They were all done in the kitchen, so you got to see the actual set of her TV shows too. All of her papers and most of her large cookbook collection were donated to the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University. Her house in Cambridge and her office in Cambridge, she donated to Smith University, and they sold the property and used it to fund a campus center at Smith. And in the following year, 2002, she became the first woman inducted into the Culinary Hall of Fame. In 2003, she received the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the U.S., awarded to her by George W. Bush. And the year after that, on August 13th, 2004, she passed away in her sleep 2 days before her 92nd birthday. And she passed away in California with this little kitten, her little black and white kitten, in bed with her, at her side. Because she always loved cats, and that was a good way for her to go. Well, during her long and very productive life, Julia Child received honorary degrees from Harvard, Boston University, Bates College, Rutgers, and Smith College. She was an active member and a generous supporter of the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Some of you may be a member of that. I am. She's the largest it's the largest professional culinary organization in the world. And then she was also a big supporter of public television. She wouldn't do commercial television TV series. She would appear on ABC or NBC morning shows to do 5-minute cooking demonstrations. But she would never go off to commercial television. She wouldn't do if they had it, the Food Network or the Food Channel, because she strongly believed in public television, and she donated a lot of money to public television. During her lifetime, she wrote or co-authored 17 cookbooks. These are some of the ones you might recognize. She starred in 375 television cooking shows, each a half hour or an hour long, and including a popular series that some of you might have seen with Jacques Pepin here. She appeared, as I said, in dozens of television spots that are 5-minute cooking demonstrations, excuse me, and radio interviews, And she did this all after the age of 50, so there's hope for some of us yet. Several biographies have been written about her. This is really the largest and most detailed, and I think if you're interested in reading about her life, that's a good one to start with. This one is one of my favorites. It was the letters she wrote to and got from her friend Avis Devoto, who became her literary agent for the publication of her books in America, her first ones. And it's really good because it deals a lot with the politics of the McCarthy era in the 1950s, and also the process of writing, testing, developing recipes, testing and writing recipes, and getting that first cookbook published. Sorry. This one, Backstage with Julia, is about, and it really is a lot about the backstage of putting on a cooking show, cooking series. And if you're interested in television production, that's a very good one. This one is about her and Paul's life working overseas with the OSS. I haven't read this one myself, although I've heard that it has more about the OSS than about them, but I don't know. It's supposed to be an interesting book. This is another one that I recommend too. It's another biography of her. And it's funny, I think I've read every biography of her that's been published except that one about the OSS. And I always find something in addition in them, you know, that's covering a lot of the same ground, but there's always something new. And then, of course, the famous film, Julia and Julia, that was made about her. And how many of you saw that, either here or, yeah, good, right. Either here or when it came out. I think Meryl Streep is a great actress, and she captured Julia really, really well. Her voice, her gestures. Tom and I saw this film in McKinney on a Monday afternoon, and there was a larger audience than you usually get for a matinee. Most of them were younger than we were, and every time Meryl Streep was in a scene, Tom and I were going, oh my gosh, it's Julia. She got it right. And we were just almost falling off our chair with laughter to see someone who did such a good job of portraying Julia Child. She really nailed it. That's another. And now people are even writing books about her cats, all right? They're going to milk the Julia Child name forever, I think. This one, Minette's Feast, this one is a children's book, so we're getting into those now too, and with the cat. All of her cats, despite how much she loved them, she didn't give them different names. They were either Minou or Minette, which is sort of French for kitty. Everywhere she lived, she had a Minou or a Minette. This is the cat they had in Paris when they first lived there. This is their cat in Provence, in the sink. Looks just like my tabby cat hunting food in the kitchen. This is a very familiar scene. Oops, sorry. You know that one. Let me go back one. She has been caricatured many times, and of course her whole style of speaking and acting and walking and talking, everything, lent itself to caricature, and then everybody probably recognizes the scene from the 1978 skit on Saturday Night Live where Dan Aykroyd parodied her show. She's been featured in a Google Doodle. She's been used on many kinds of posters. I don't think all of those were with her permission to use her picture, but pictured on many of them anyway. Even satirized in this movie poster for Doughfinger instead of Goldfinger, right? And the more you read it, the funnier it is, actually. People who knew her better than I did described her as this: energetic, optimistic, determined, strong-willed, gracious, tough, gentle, competitive, generous, opinionated, funny and fun-loving, serious, informative, demanding, frustrating, eloquent, and full of life. And almost everyone who knew her thought of her as a lady with a capital L. And that's how somebody that I knew told me that was the way he always thought of her, was lady with the capital L. She had many sides to her personality, obviously. She was a socialite from a very wealthy, very conservative Republican family, but as an adult, she became a lifelong Democrat and a major supporter of progressive causes. And she said, I was a Republican until I got to New York and had to live on $18 a week. It was then I became a Democrat. She was also known and quoted often for her pithy sayings, like this one, if you're afraid of butter, use cream. She was a culinary professional who would have nothing to do with the latest food fads or the trendy diets or what she called the food police. The only time to eat diet food is while you're waiting for the steak to cook. Isn't that a good one to live by? She loved kitchen gadgets, and her kitchens were full of cookware and gadgets from all over the world. And that's what she did, right? She used them to whack the hell out of a chicken. But she learned her first cooking techniques in France, and she learned them by hand. She learned how to beat egg whites with a whisk in a copper bowl and not using an electric mixer. She learned how to pound fish with a mortar and pestle instead of pulverizing it in a food processor. She knew how to do all the basics to begin with by hand. She was both a night owl and a morning person, which is unusual that you get both. You're usually one or the other. Even in her 80s, she could party hard until well after midnight, and then she would get up at 5 the next morning, rode her exercise bike for 20 minutes, had a big breakfast, and was ready to tape her TV show at 6 o'clock in the morning. And she didn't do this just once in a while. She did this day after day after day. She professed moderation in all things, including eating, drinking, and moderation. She always ate a big breakfast: bacon, eggs, buttered toast, jam, fresh fruit, and coffee. She consumed more butter, eggs, and red meat than most of us will eat in our entire lives. And she attributed her own longevity to red meat and gin. She smoked for at least 40 years. She drank alcohol every day until the last couple years of her life. She had wine all the time at lunch and at dinner, and often that was preceded by a cocktail before dinner. But she was never an alcoholic, and she never appeared on screen or even to any of her friends, never was drunk. So people thought she was because they saw the way she acted on TV, but that's just the way she was, acting sober, so she wasn't drunk. One of her favorite quotations was, "As you get older, you shouldn't waste time drinking bad wine." As I said, she had a radical mastectomy. She also had a knee replacement, a hip operation, and three facelifts. She was 6 feet 2 inches tall, wore size 12 shoes, loved cats, and lived to be 2 days short of 92 years old. She always believed that the pleasures of the table and the pleasures of life are infinite. So may we all live as long and as well as Julia Child did. Thank you. Bon appetit. I'll be glad to answer questions.
Here you go. When she went to France, did she understand French, and could she read French?
It's a really good question. I do not know the exact answer to that. Somebody asked me that a couple days ago. I think, though, I know she took French lessons when she got there. Being an educated woman from Smith College at the time, now university, it's very likely she might have had French in college, all right, but I just can't remember. But I do know that once she got there, she took French. And as I said, her husband, Paul, was totally fluent in French because he'd lived there for something like 10 years as a child with his family. So they were always conversing in French. She had him at home to talk with, and then everything, of course, in the cooking school, too, when she went to Cordon Bleu. So it's kind of an immersion project, yeah, for sure. Good question. Thank you.
Did she ever have a weight problem?
No, she got thicker as she got older, as most of us do, or some of us do anyway. But at 6 feet 2, she had a high metabolism. She was very tall, and she was very energetic for most of her life. So you didn't see her heavier until she got into those pictures. The French chef, we're talking 50s, and she's in her 50s and 60s. And the pictures where she's really heavier is when she's in her 80s and 90s. But yeah, she didn't diet. She did not believe in dieting at all. She was lucky with that metabolism.
Anyone else? Oh. When did she get that boyfriend you were talking about? I mean, after her husband died?
Yes. After her husband died. When her husband was in the nursing home, because this was a family friend of both of them, the other man would escort her because she was older, you know, and sometimes it's nice to have someone to put your arm and hold on to when you're walking places and stuff. And so I think they'd known him for 20 years or something. But she didn't officially date him, and she wouldn't have when her husband was in the nursing home because she wasn't that kind of person.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Here we go.
I have a question. As a person who came from another country, do American women actually follow those recipes of her?
Ah, very good question. She
Holmes
asked, do
and-
American women really follow those recipes of hers? I'll tell you, if you do pot de creme like they did in the demonstration tonight, and you do it by her recipe in Mastering the Art of French Cooking, you'll spend a lot more time making it. Mastering the Art of French Cooking, which I still use a lot, I use for cooking and use for research. Those are more complicated recipes, take more steps, take more time. Her later books, not that she was trying to cut corners or anything, but her later books use things like food processors and hand mixers and things that would make it easier, not packaged mixes or anything like that. She believed in cooking from scratch. And I do think there are a lot of people who use her cookbooks. I don't think the millions and millions of books that she has sold were just for people to kind of look at and put up on the shelf. Certainly, I think that people do cook from them because the recipes work. And that's one of the things she told me, was that any cookbook is no better than the worst recipe in it. And that's why she tested all of her recipes over and over and over again. And I have told this to other groups of people who are cookbook writers, as am I, and I've told them what Julia said about it, and they would go, oh, thinking, oh my gosh, because they didn't have the same standards that Julia did about that. And that's why her books are so popular. They do work, yes.
When I first came to America, and I, as a present, the first week that I came here, I got the 2 books, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And this is the way how I learned to cook in America, because everything was different here. The butter was different, you had different vegetables, the cuts of meat were different. And so Julia taught me to cook in America.
That's a very good point. And someone mentioned to me earlier, well, if she was developing and testing all these recipes in France, where you weigh out dry ingredients, what about her American cookbooks? And so she had to convert them into American measures. Although if it's a dish baking, for instance, where you really need to have the flour weighed out, and the flour will weigh differently on a dry day than a humid day, then she still uses that in her cookbooks. I think in her later cookbooks, it's more and more using just American volume measurements, whether it's dry or liquid ingredients. But that's interesting that you learned to cook American from Julia Child's French, which she started doing in France and had learned to do the European way first.
Because the butter and the flour is different here.
The butter and the flour, they're all different, yes. And that's why good recipes will say bleached or unbleached all-purpose flour or whatever in America. If you've got a German cookbook, it will say number 01 or number 38 flour or whatever, and you're going, what is that? You know, because there's even a German cookbook called But the Flour is Different, you know, published in America, yes. So Julia dealt with that all of her life. But, you know, she was a smart lady, and she knew how to make all these conversions. And making those recipe conversions, as this gentleman asked earlier at the demonstration, it's really important. And I say this to, when I work as a cookbook editor, I say this to people who are writing recipes for me. You can't just send me something, A, that you haven't tested, and B, that you are, say, if you're a chef, and you say, well, I want 2 ounces of cinnamon, and I want 20 ounces of flour. I'm going, the American cook at home is not going to do that. You tell me how many tablespoons or teaspoons of cinnamon that is. You tell me how many cups of what kind of flour that is. And you have to make those conversions. And it's really much more complicated than a lot of people realize. You have to weigh out everything in weight, and then you have to check what its volume is in an American 8-ounce cup. And she did that all the time. She really knew how to do it well.
Here you go.
And the importance of doing it. Yes, next question.
Okay, so I just curious. I remember you introduced that Julia went to the China in the World War II, right? So what did she do over there?
She was with the Office of Strategic Services there, and that was the job that she started in Washington, D.C., and they sent her overseas during the war. So first she worked in Ceylon, and then her boyfriend, Paul, that she married later, got reassigned to China, and a couple months later she got reassigned to China. So they were there working in essentially what the CIA does now.
Oh, okay.
That kind of thing. And he knew General Joseph Stilwell. That's one reason when we were discussing Stilwell and the American experience in China, she's talking about people she knew, you know, and we were talking about the book we'd read. And she thought that was actually a very good book, too, so I recommend it to you also. But yes, she was working essentially for the CIA, but as handling classified documents, registering them, keeping them in the correct files where they could be found again, and also taken or transmitted to Washington.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and another question is, do you know what kind of Chinese food did she like, and did she cook Chinese food?
She didn't cook. I asked her about that, and she didn't cook Chinese food much at home because she said there were so many good restaurants that she could go to in other parts of the world. But she loved it, and I think what she loved was from the area of Kunming and Chongqing, because that's where she learned to eat it. And so she did not like Hunanese or Sichuanese because she thought it was really, really too hot spicy for her taste. Yes.
Sir, did you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering about what her parents thought of her, or any other relatives, or anything like that.
They thought she jumped off the deep end marrying this radical Paul, all right, who was not a conservative Republican like the family was. They were not happy about the marriage, but on the other hand, they were happy that their daughter, who was 34 years old, was finally getting married. So they had a kind of an ambivalent attitude toward that, yeah. And she was closer to her mother than her father, yes.
Did they live long enough to see her do the TV shows?
That's a
and the
really good
books?
question, and I can't answer that. I imagine the biography, the first biography I showed up there will probably have it because it's about that thick. It's a really detailed book, but I can't answer that.
I had a very dear elderly friend of the family who served in the OSS with both of them.
Oh,
was there.
wonderful.
And a story he would tell about her, their job was also to confuse the enemies as well as try to gather information. One story about Julie was that they had learned that there was a wonderful, very private reception going on. And so she wrote invitation, and they multiplied them, had them produce like about 1,000 copies, and went through the city and gave everybody a copy.
To
So
go
they
to a
would-
Chinese
so-
reception.
So they would
Yeah.
go out to this Chinese imperial reception. They expected 40 people, and they had like 1,400. And that was Julia's job.
That is wonderful because that's really in keeping with her personality. She was known when she was growing up in California, and then when she went to college, she was known for doing practical jokes. And that's just typical. And it's a really good example. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I love that. Anybody else knew people who knew her? No. Okay. Yes, we have a question? Yes.
Yes, her relationship with the other two women that she formed the cooking school with, obviously one was a long-term relationship because she had a summer home there. How about the other, and how long was their cooking school?
The
How many years
cooking
did it
school, I think the cooking school sort of faltered after she got sent with Paul to Marseille, okay, 1953, so only about a year. The other two women may have kept it up for a while, but they were the three gourmands, not the two. That was the name of the school, so she wasn't really associated with it because she couldn't be on site in Paris to teach. Her relationship with them was that she had the opportunity to do this cookbook, which became the Mastering of the Art of French Cooking, with the three women. But by the time it was finished, it was only Julia and Simone Beck, Simca, her friend, who really did all the work. And Louisette Berthold was, you know, she felt like, oh, well, I've contributed this recipe, or I did this or that. Well, none of her recipes really worked very well. Julia had to redo them completely. So they eventually bought her out for the second cookbook. But listen, believe me, this happens more than you realize in publishing. I had it happen with my first cookbook, that someone who had contributed only a small amount, but was in on the project from the beginning, got equal credit with those of us who did all the work. So, yeah. But Simca remained her good friend for the rest of their lives. Yes.
Hang on. Hang on. Hang on. Gotta wait. They gotta get you on tape.
Wasn't Jacques Pepin her nephew?
No.
I thought her sister, because I think there was a biography.
The
by
biography was by Paul Prudhomme,
Oh, there
who
we
was her
go.
nephew. Yes,
Okay, there
yes,
we are. Thank
yes.
you.
And he collaborated with her on the book My Life in France. Yeah.
Oh, do we have anybody who hasn't asked a question already? 'Cause did you have a question? Here.
What was her all-time favorite dish? Was it the beef?
Buff bourguignon, right, yeah. That's what I thought when I met her. But, you know, she was asked that question probably a zillion times. And her attitude was, you know, it was what I'm eating today, if it's good. You know, so she wouldn't pin herself down on that one.
What is your favorite dish? Simple enough to begin with from her books.
I'm sorry, what was that?
What is your favorite food from her, favorite recipe from her book?
Guess what? We still use her buff bourguignon. We love that. Yes, yeah. And sometimes when you try to want to do a shortcut or something, and we're not happy with it, and we go back to Julia's for that one. But I've got about 2,000 cookbooks at home, so I don't rely on just one or two. I use them for research, and I use Julia's anytime I'm looking for two things. I use them if I'm looking at research on French cooking, or also if I'm looking at research on techniques, because her techniques are so right on, so spot on. And so if I'm looking at about the best way to do this, and when I write recipes, and Julia did the same sort of thing, you are looking at a lot of sources, whether they're the chef you talked with at the French restaurant who gave you the recipe, or a friend or whatever, and in my case, it's cookbooks. And I'll make a spreadsheet, not on a computer, but just on yellow pads turned this way, and make a spreadsheet of all the different ingredients and compare all the recipes and compare all the techniques. And I use Julia's a lot for that, and hers are right. Yes.
Here you go.
After she was established and had proven her own skills, did she bring along new chefs, sort
Yes.
of like we see today?
Yes, yes, yes. Because she was one of the people who was really instrumental in starting the International Association of Cooking Schools, which became the International Association of Culinary Professionals, branched out from being just schools to being food writers like me, publishers, editors, people like that. And she was a mentor to a lot of people, yes, whether they were people like Sarah Moulton, who would become a chef, or other people who were writers. She was very, very helpful, and she's provided a lot of scholarship money for food studies programs too. She believed very strongly in education and supported it. Thank you, and say bon appetit.